Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 31st episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Before we start today, I want to mention something about some of the word usage in the upcoming episodes. For that matter, some of the words that I used in the prior episodes. I use words a lot like populist and conservative, and quite frequently. I want to stress that I am using these words as they meant in the Roman times, or at least within the context of the Roman political system. Nothing in the episode that follows, as is true of this entire series to date and into the future, is intended to be taken as subtle commentary on modern politics. Part of the reason I love ancient history so much is that no one gets terribly offended if I have a strong opinion about, say, Cato the Younger. And I really do have a strong opinion about Cato the Younger. He destroyed what he loved because he refused to acknowledge that it had changed. Okay, more on that to come. So with that out of the way, last time we followed Pompey from the time of his first consulship through to the formation, renewal, and collapse of the first triumvirate. Over that same time, Pompey followed with increasing consternation the meteoric rise of his erstwhile ally and former father-in-law, Julius Caesar. This elevation of Caesar in the hearts and minds of the Roman citizens left Pompey with a rival, someone who was equal in status and affection for the first time since the death of Sulla, a quarter of a century earlier. Pompey had enjoyed a long run at the top of the Roman world, and while populists and petty nobles had popped up here and there, no one ever really challenged Pompey as king of the hill until Caesar. It was an uncomfortable situation for Pompey, the great lion of so many campaigns, the undisputed and indispensable leading citizen, the final authority on so many important matters of state. But the last few years of the 50s BCE, Caesar had clearly positioned himself as the leader of the populares. Indeed, despite his unmatched noble credentials, Caesar had taken great pains to forge a deep bond with the common citizen and advance legislation that promoted their case, including land reform that opened up state lands to smallholder farmers and the strengthening of anti-bribery and anti-coercion laws. These moves rankled conservatives, but the people loved him, and he built a huge base of popular support. This was more than a cynical or exploitative political strategy. Unlike members of the oligarchy, Caesar seems to have had a genuine concern for the plight of the urban poor, the disenfranchised, the dispossessed. His family was ancient. As mentioned last week, they even claimed descent from the goddess Venus. But when he was a kid, the Julii had fallen on difficult times, and he grew up in a neighborhood called the Suburra. It was the bad part of town, so to speak. As a result, unlike his fellow nobles who grew up in nicer areas, he lived among, spoke with, and grew up alongside the poorer elements of Rome's civic life. He did not demonize or vilify the poor. On the contrary, he connected with them, and in time, he would become their strongest advocate. He only left the neighborhood at age 37 when he won the election as Pontifex Maximus. That gig came with a big house located right in the heart of the Forum, which put Caesar quite literally in the middle of public life. He might have left the Suburra, but he never forgot its residents. Much of Caesar's political base stemmed from his championing of the causes of these common citizens, but many of the legislative wins that Caesar had been able to accomplish as consul had only come by ignoring the dubious claims of ill omens made by his obstinate colleague Bibulus. Caesar was a focused and determined man and rarely let technicalities get in his way. One of the quirks of Roman law was that a consul was immune from prosecution during their term of office, but when that term ended, immunity also expired. Often, the political enemies of a magistrate rushed in to bring charges as terms expired. Sometimes these kinds of charges had merit. Other times they were political farce. But valid or not, charging a now former magistrate with various crimes could pose a serious threat to the accused. Indeed, as Caesar's consulship had wound down in 59 BCE, Caesar's adversaries had similar designs to bring charges against him in order to check his rise. You may recall that when his consulship had expired, Caesar had arranged to take command in Gaul. He had only managed to be able to do this by slipping quietly out of the city to assume his provincial command before his enemies had a chance to pounce. As long as he stayed in his provinces, he was just out of reach, immune from prosecution in the Roman courts. This is why Crassus and Pompey had traveled to Caesar when the three met to renew their partnership and plan for the future. It's also why renewing Caesar's command in Gaul was such an important part of the agreement. It kept Caesar away from Rome for a further 5 years, letting him plunder and maraud back and forth across the provinces, winning new glory, enriching himself and the troops, and rendering him impervious to the political machinations back at the capital. When Julia, then Crassus, died, the bonds that had linked Caesar and Pompey had been shattered. This came at a time of heightened political violence in Rome. Rival factions were all but at war in the streets. Blood was cast more often than ballots. In 52 BCE, with the glowing embers of the partnership between Caesar and Pompey dying, the elections for consul had to be suspended on account of all this political violence. The republican system of government, which had been running with all its warts and hiccups for more than 400 years, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Not to get too far afield here, but one of the prime reasons for this chaos was an unwillingness of some of the elites at the top of the oligarchy to consider reforms that would allow greater access to economic opportunity and political institutions for everyone else, especially the poor and dispossessed, who were, according to Roman law, citizens too. Occasional attempts at reform had come from both within and outside the oligarchy. Time and again, such reform programs were met with abject brutality. All the way back in the 2nd century BCE, one conservative reactionary had slaughtered 3,000 of his adversaries, then unironically built a temple to Concordia, the goddess of harmony and peace and agreement. Unironic because he believed that his slaughter had brought about harmony, peace, and agreement. It's hard to have harmony when everyone else is dead. These spasms of violence only ever brought about a temporary cessation of any given crisis, and resentment and revenge were always high on the to-do list of any agitator, popular or conservative. By the close of the 50s BCE, this violence crippled the state and the gears of electing magistrates had ground to a halt. In these muddied waters, some members of the Optimates saw a clear opportunity. The relationship between Caesar and Pompey had been a great threat to the conservatives, especially when the two were aligned behind populist causes. But when the relationship grew strained, and Caesar was all the way off in Gaul, a light bulb went off for some political operatives. If the Optimates could draw Pompey to their side, then they could put the final nail in the coffin of the triumvirate, gain the endorsement of one of the titans of Roman history, and fight back the tide of populare reform. And Pompey had shown, time and again, his need to be needed trumped any political ideology. So they began courting him to their side by appealing to his ego, and the opening salvo came from an unexpected place. Caesar's consular colleague, the one that pretended to see ill omens and tried to suspend the mechanisms of state, was, you may recall, Bibulus. Half a dozen years later, and Bibulus was still resentful of Pompey for the ill treatment that the triumvir's thugs had showered on him, driving him into self-imposed house arrest. Yet Bibulus was the one who brought forward the notion that in 52 BCE, with the consular elections suspended on account of violence, Pompey was the one man who could save Rome from the chaos. The idea of appointing him as dictator was considered, but quickly dismissed as impractical. Perhaps the memory of Sulla still lurked in the collective consciousness. You may recall that while dictator, Sulla conveniently murdered about 9,000 people, and so the idea of making Pompey as the savior come dictator was quickly dismissed. But Bibulus then rose in the Senate and proposed a radical solution to Rome's current challenges. Pompey should be appointed sole consul, still subject to all the checks on monarchical power within the Roman constitution, but without a colleague to get in his way. There was an irony in this solution, as the conservative Romans generally disdained innovation in governance, and yet the proposal was absolutely an innovation. If the Senate backed this move, then they would create something more than a consul and less than a dictator, and would be counting on the enormous prestige and skill of one man to reset the teetering republic back on its foundations. For their part, the conservatives knew this was a gamble. They were handing the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, to a guy who had swung back and forth from conservative champion and populist agitator, shifting with the winds of fortune whenever it benefited him to do so. My old friend, historian Plutarch, has Bibulus acknowledging their dilemma, stating that, quote, the city would either be set free from the prevailing disorder or would become the slave of its strongest man. Close quote. High risk, high reward. The most stern and humorless member of the conservative faction was Cato the Younger. He's yet another character that deserves more time in the sun than he will get here. But of all of the people in history that took themselves way too seriously, Cato might be at the very top of the heap. A big brain and a sour disposition, Cato was a hardcore traditionalist from the "this generation will doom us all, things were better when people were tougher" school of thought. Incidentally, it is a constant of human history that people have thought that younger generations were spoiled, deviant, lazy, amoral, and destined to bring everything crashing down. Cato felt that deeply in his soul, and he was relentless in pushing for a return to the quote-unquote traditional Roman values of bygone generations. The idea of this innovation in government, one consul without a colleague, was just the kind of thing that Cato frothed at the mouth decrying. So everyone got hushed and leaned in to hear what he had to say in response to this proposal. He then surprised many when he came out in favor of the agreement. The Senate thus passed the motion and, forgoing the process of electing a magistrate, simply appointed Pompey to the supreme post in the land and told him he could choose his own colleague after a couple months had gone by if he thought it necessary. In order to save the Constitution, the conservatives completely ignored it. Kind of a recipe for disaster, if you ask me. At the time of this arrangement, Pompey gained a colleague of a different sort. Signaling his embrace of the conservative faction, he married again, this time to Cornelia Metella, widow of the recently deceased Publius Crassus, son of Marcus Crassus, who, like his father, had died at Carrhae. Caesar, keen to keep the lifeline between him and Pompey, had offered another relative for the widower Pompey to wed, his niece Attia, the daughter of his sister. Attia will become very important in the history of Rome in a few years when her son, Gaius Octavius, rises to the forefront. But that's a bit down the road, and for now, Pompey spurned this offer and with it any promise of future collaboration between the two former partners. Attia would have to content herself with knowing that in about 2,000 years, HBO would create an incredible series called, Rome, and that she would be a main character, albeit one that bears almost no resemblance whatsoever to what Attia was actually like in real life. It's a great show, though, but viewer beware, it is not exactly child or family friendly. Anyway, Cornelia, despite her connections to the family of the dead triumvir Crassus, hailed from another ancient and conservative family. She was about 33 years the junior of her new husband. Even for a society used to a wide age gap between older grooms and younger brides, this was a bit eyebrow-raising, with some observers suggesting Cornelia was a better match for one of Pompey's sons than for the great general. Yet, her aristocratic and political connections were vital to the project, as she hailed from some of the most pedigreed families in Rome. Her father, 9 years Pompey's junior, bore the preposterous name Quintus Cecilius Metellus Pius Scipio Nasica, and was further bolstered by events when Pompey duly appointed him as his consular colleague. In case you missed that, with this new marriage, Pompey was 9 years older than his father-in-law. Romans could be really weird sometimes, at least according to our conventions. Bibulus, Cato, Metellus Scipio, Pompey lined up with all the hardcore optimates, and for their part, they were happy to have him. They co-opted his huge reputation away from populist causes and recast it, and him, as the defender of ancient conservative oligarchic rights. For his part, Pompey got to reposition himself at the center of the inner circle of the elites of the elites. Not bad for a kid from the sticks. Together, they worked to enact laws that aimed to stabilize Rome and box in their opponents. For example, one, Gaius Julius Caesar. Still, all was not smooth sailing for Pompey, and while he did his best to bring calm and order to the city, he did so with the help of an armed guard, which tended to dampen the enthusiasm of political agitators, but did little to quiet the devotion that they felt to their causes. It's worth stating, Rome needed reform. The solution was not to go back to some bygone era. The city had changed. The people had changed. The values have changed. No amount of conservative hand-wringing for a return to a better time was going to solve the issues at the heart of Rome's instability. Even a 400-year-old republic needs to reform itself from time to time. The optimates were fighting for an age to which it was actually impossible to return. And it wasn't like the optimates could be trusted to hold themselves to account. Quick to level slurs at the rank and file, the corruption across the top of the oligarchy was deep and pervasive. At one point, Pompey's new father-in-law was accused of bribery, and Pompey personally intervened to undermine the case, not through evidence or stirring oratory, but by calling in favors and influencing the jurors. It was after these charges were dropped that Pompey had named his father-in-law to be his co-consul for the rest of 52 BCE, further elevating the prestige of Metellus Scipio and therefore himself. But it wasn't all work for Pompey. More than a few people whispered that while various crises gripped Rome, Pompey was just a little too focused on enjoying his new bride and not enough on serving the Republic in its hour of need. Pompey's third consulship ended with the close of 52 BCE. He didn't really accomplish all that much, but it's hard to argue that his prestige, and his armed bodyguard, had helped calm the political waters of the late Republic. The question that remained was if this new stability could last. Before leaving office, the Senate agreed that Pompey should retain his provincial commands, which he could administer in absentia from Rome, and, crucially, retain control of the legions in these provinces. Further, he was granted a hefty stipend of 1,000 talents per year to keep the troops fed, equipped, and paid. In short, Pompey had an army and a war chest solely at his command, even as he left office. He was a sort of dictator at large. The conservatives once again showed that they had no hesitation suspending their own constitution if it meant that they could consolidate political power in their favor. In the consular elections of 51 and 50 BCE, the offices were stacked with avowed anti-Caesarians. In echoes of Sulla's conservative reforms, the Optimates passed legislation to make sure that Caesar's action from his time in the consulship were all declared illegal, and again made those laws retroactive. This was a dramatic escalation in political maneuvering. The conservative-dominated Senate was trying to box Caesar in, neutering his political power and making him less a champion of the people and more a fugitive of a bunch of laws that they just made up for such a purpose. In reality, they backed a tiger into a corner. Caesar's proconsular governorship of Gaul was set to expire at the close of 49 BCE, at which time he would lose his imperium, the cloak of immunity that protected sitting magistrates, thus leaving him vulnerable to prosecution. To worm his way out of the trap his enemies were setting for him, Caesar decided to stand for the consulship for 48 BCE. He managed to make arrangements to maintain his candidacy even while away in Gaul, which would have allowed him to never have to cross the border of his province outside the cloak of his office and thus void his imperium. He could have transitioned from sacrosanct proconsular governor to sacrosanct consul and kept himself impervious to charges for at least another year. Maybe as consul he could find a way to reverse the farcical legislation that the conservatives had been ramming through. Cato, destined to become one of Caesar's most obstinate foes, blocked this measure. He demanded that in order to be a candidate, Caesar had to be a private citizen, and in order to be a private citizen, he had to lay down his command, leave the safety of his army camp, and be present in Rome. Pompey refused to intervene in the ensuing debate, which essentially served as an endorsement of Cato's position. To further drive home the point, Pompey sent Caesar a letter requesting of the 2 legions that Pompey had loaned to Caesar as part of their triumvirate machinations. Caesar understood this for what it was, an attempt to strengthen Pompey's army while also weakening Caesar. It became apparent that the tenuous end to the civil war brought about by the close of the Marian-Sullan War was on shaky footing. Caesar was not about to allow himself to be stripped of an army, forced to trial in court, and humiliated, robbed of his hard-won reputation, dignity, and fortune. The Senate, backed by Pompey's muscle and his own enormous reputation, was not going to allow the populous Caesar to escape their traps. He was, as they saw it, the last formidable obstacle to a conservative reversion to the glory days. Caesar had to go. With the threat of war looming and growing more ominous by the day, Caesar weighed up how to handle Pompey's request to hand back a significant portion of Caesar's army. Perhaps to everyone's surprise, Caesar complied, discharging Pompey's legions, who by now must have felt a stronger connection to the hero of Gaul than to some guy back in Rome who hadn't fought with them in years. To make sure they didn't miss the point, he sent these troops home laden with treasure. Pompey hadn't made them rich. Caesar had. Caesar was still being very careful to act above the board and in full compliance with the law and with tradition. In 50 BCE, as tensions between Caesar and the Optimates grew, Pompey fell gravely ill at one of his palaces near Naples. A hush fell over the Republic as people held their breath and waited on word of his condition. An anxious population made sacrifices in his name, imploring the gods to restore the great hero of Rome to his health. In time, Pompey recovered, and a relieved populace erupted into demonstrations of joy and thanksgiving. Crowds mobbed Pompey wherever he went, with Rome shouting their gratitude to him for all he had done for Rome. Always a bit insecure, Pompey was thrilled with this public response. The people still loved him. All was well with the world. His head swelled. He grew cocky. In this surge of pride, Pompey fell into a logical fallacy. For while it was clear that the people still loved him, Pompey looked at their expression of love as zero-sum, meaning they must only love him or love him more than any other. What Pompey missed is that while the outpouring of joy from the people was genuine, these same masses were just as capable of also loving Caesar, and they most assuredly did, as events would show soon enough. This hubris was compounded by a Pompeian partisan who whispered in the great general's ear that the troops recently sent back by Caesar hated Caesar, that they were overjoyed for the change in command, and that they longed for a chance to fight their former commander. Thus, as tensions between Caesar and the Optimates grew critical, Pompey waved off the threat of war. Caesar was nothing, easily brushed aside. Any attempt to invade Italy would be a suicide mission because, Pompey said, should he need to deal with a Caesarian invasion, quote, "In whatever part of Italy I stamp upon the ground, there will spring up armies of foot and horse." Close quote. Before matters culminated into open hostilities, Caesar tried another method of ensuring a smooth re-entry for himself into private life. Bribery. Wealthy beyond description from his 10 years of constant campaigning, sacking, and marauding, Caesar opened up the checkbook and sent small fortunes to consuls and tribunes alike. Caesar also tried more conventional means to influence events, regularly sending his troops on leave so they could head to Rome, vote an election, and serve as the proconsul's eyes and ears. Despite the whispers promoted by one of Pompey's sycophants, Caesar's troops loved him. He worked hard to cultivate their trust and loyalty, and their devotion to him as a commander was nearly absolute. When one of Caesar's officers was back in Rome, he was told that the Senate would not grant Caesar an extension of his command. The furious officer then grabbed the hilt of his sword and then said, quote, "Then this will give it," close quote. His machination worked to soften the hostility, but the headwinds against Caesar were strong and the results were mixed. Matters reached their apex when Curio, a tribune on Caesar's payroll, offered an unexpected proposal. In order to avoid civil war, both Caesar and Pompey must both lay down their commands, dismiss their armies, and become private citizens. The gambit almost worked, and most senators seemed to favor the compromise measure and avoid civil war. But a few diehard optimates in the Senate refused to budge, Cato prominent among them. The Senate began to actively prepare for war. They commanded that Pompey begin recruiting an army, ready to either deter an invasion from Caesar or preferably to march into his provinces and crush him there. Pompey reluctantly and slowly began to move to action, but he was surprised at the tepid response he received. Troops just didn't want to get dragged into another civil war, and upon their discharges, many of the soldiers Pompey were counting on were spread out over a wide territory. Mustering was painfully slow. So much for stamping his feet and having whole armies rise from the soil. To make matters worse, Caesar sent Mark Antony, yes, that Mark Antony, a kinsman and a trusted lieutenant, to address the people on Caesar's behalf. Standing in the forum, Antony read a letter from Caesar in which he laid out his position, stressing that he was willing to lay down his army and sharing the details of the populist reforms he would like to enact for their benefit. Caesar even offered to turn himself over to the people in order that they could judge for themselves the legality of his actions. Popular as such policies would have been with the masses, the obstinate Senate again refused to budge. They were committed, fatally as it would turn out, to a game of brinksmanship, and they were not going to back down. Cicero, ever the committed optimate, was nonetheless a pragmatist, frantic to avoid war, and understanding the rhetoric, principles, and ideals tended to be poor armor against swords and shields. He tried to broker compromise measures, but every attempt at de-escalation was met with scorn by Pompey and a cabal of dedicated and avowed conservative Republicans who would not allow any compromise with Caesar under any circumstances. Caesar was out of options. He had been open to compromise, and he worked to solve the deadlock, yielding here, offering concessions there. He offered to be a private citizen. He offered to put himself to the judgment of the people. He offered to lay out what policies he would enact. He really approached the impasse with an open mind and looking for solutions. The only thing he wouldn't allow was for himself to be prosecuted as a private citizen for his consular actions a decade earlier. But this was the sticking point, as the optimates were unequivocally committed to destroying the career of their populist rival. Frustrated at every turn by the obstinance of Pompey and his allies, and with all his efforts at compromise thwarted, Caesar contemplated the unthinkable. Pompey could easily have de-escalated the tensions, but he loved being loved, and in the end, his need to be at the center of the rich and powerful proved to be a great weakness. The year of 49 BCE would be epochal in the history of Rome. Early in that year, as new consuls took the term of office, the conservatives in the Senate held total sway. With Cato in the lead, just days into the new year, the Senate unanimously voted Caesar an enemy of the state under the provision known as the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate. 4 of Caesar's trusted allies, including Mark Antony and Gaius Cassius Longinus, yep, that Cassius, dressed themselves as slaves and snuck out of Rome, frantically charging north to meet Caesar and warn him of the latest developments. There was no more debate. Cato put his foot down, but the armies that sprung up in Italy were not those loyal to Pompey or the optimates, but rather Caesar. The boundary of Caesar's province was the river Rubicon. His army was not concentrated and still spread out across their various winter quarters. He only had 1 legion encamped with him. In theory, Pompey could muster a massive force to confront Caesar, but Pompey had been a bit lax in preparing, content with his reputation and bolstered by the belief and the adoration of the masses. Early in the morning hours of January 11th, Caesar sent a small detachment of trusted troops to advance and quietly seize the city of Arminium. Shortly after, a pensive Caesar stood on the banks of the river. On one side of the Rubicon, the continued conflict with the Senate with no end in sight. On the other, Italy and civil war. He is said to have muttered, "The die is cast," and famously crossed the Rubicon, giving us the modern idiom for a point of no return. Indeed, there was no going back for Caesar, and for that matter, for Pompey. Their tension had been words and letters, speeches in the forums, orations in the Senate, addresses to assembled troops. The time for words was over. Rome was again embroiled in civil war. Caesar rode to link up with his advance guard at Arminium, which he promptly made his headquarters. His 13th legion soon joined him. When Sulla had first advanced on Rome, all but one of his senior officers, Lucullus, refused to march by his side. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, all but one, Titus Labienus, joined their commander. Caesar held Labienus no ill will. Despite his defection from the cause, Caesar gave Labienus free passage, knowing that one of his most trusted and competent deputies would soon be fighting against him. Caesar was big on allowing people to follow their conscience. Well, to a point. Caesar had invaded Italy with 1 legion, a paltry force as compared to what Pompey commanded, at least on paper. It was shocking. All things being equal, this was a tiny, almost minuscule force compared to the strength of Pompey. But Caesar's invasion somehow caught the Senate completely by surprise and threw Rome into chaos. Given how small this available force was, the Senate didn't seem to think Caesar would actually put it into the field. For all of their bluster, the Optimates seemed to have been surprised that Caesar would take such an action, despite the fact that they were the ones that left him little other choice. They were so sure they were right, they never thought about the consequences of their hysterical rhetoric. So, as mentioned, the root of the Senate's surprise was at least in part due to the small size of Caesar's force. It seemed like madness. It was madness. But a small army was a fast army, and Caesar was banking on speed as his best tool to prevent a strong response from Pompey. Well, that and more legions, as his 8th and 12th legions soon joined and linked up. Caesar advanced south, and town after town surrendered without a fight. For their part, the Senate voted Pompey sweeping wartime powers and tasked him with overall command in the all-of-a-sudden civil war. At the same time, ever distrustful of one-man command, they hampered Pompey and subjected him to some intricate approval processes. As Caesar moved south, one Optimate army resolved to fight, with 13,000 troops under the command of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the same guy we encountered earlier who was fated to be, in due time, the great-great-grandfather of none other than Nero. They chose the city of Corfinium as their base. The city was the capital of Picenum, the home base of Pompey and his late father, the general and consul Pompey Strabo. If ever an area should have been friendly to the Pompeian causes, it was this. And yet, the troops mustered to fight Caesar had no interest in another civil war, and no animosity for Caesar either. They were recent recruits, and they didn't have a long history of ideological alignment to one cause or the other. They surrendered en masse and went over to Caesar. He promptly organized them into several new legions, and his forces grew that much larger. For his part, Caesar pardoned Ahenobarbus, allowing him to live on the promise that he would stay out of the conflict going forward. Caesar's clemency was the stuff of legend. It was also a calculated act to burnish his reputation for fairness and even-handedness. The sudden surge of Caesar left Pompey with a difficult decision. The Senate had considerable armies on which to draw, but they were spread out all over the provinces, including in Hispania, Asia, and North Africa. Concentrating them to unite in a fight against Caesar would take time. Local conscripts could be, and were, raised, but these were green troops against Caesar's battle-hardened and ferociously loyal veterans. Sending new troops to stand against Caesar would have been sending lambs to slaughter. Should the general organize a hasty defense, pulling together whatever units of veterans and recruits he could to oppose Caesar's march? Or should he retreat, removing himself a safe distance in order to buy more time? Pompey chose retreat. Italy was to be abandoned. Rome left unfortified. Caesar could have it, for now. Pompey would head east, where he could better coordinate resources and take control of planning. Another asset on which Pompey was relying was his relation to all the client kingdoms in the east, the rulers of which owed their thrones to Pompey, stemming from his post-Mithridatic settlements, the subject of so much senatorial obstinacy all those years ago. There was definitely an irony in the fact that these settlements offered a path to saving the very people that had tried to prevent them in the first place. Pompey ordered the complete withdrawal of senatorial forces from Italy, going so far as to command all senators to join him. Failure to do so would indicate friendship with Caesar and thus mark them out as an enemy of the state and of Pompey. They complied. Pompey, the Senate, their retainers, 2 legions, and numerous recruits plodded their way to the port of Brundisium, preparing to embark for Greece, which would then become Pompey's base of operations. One of the legions with Pompey was the 15th Legion, one of the 2 that had transferred from Pompey to Caesar and back again. When war broke out, they did choose to side with Pompey. For his part, Caesar rushed into Rome and took control of the capital. Any fears of another sullen purge were quickly allayed when Caesar declared no personal enemies, nor took any steps to eliminate rivals, real or perceived. His only controversial action was to seize the state treasury and threatening the principal magistrate who tried to prevent such a sacrilege. Caesar left Rome just as soon as he'd gotten there, and he chased after Pompey at a blistering pace, trying to catch him before he disembarked for Greece. Pompey managed to get safely behind Brundisium city walls, and he waited for his fleet to arrive for the difficult crossing of the Adriatic. Caesar arrived in February. Again, this is 49 BCE, and he laid siege to the city. But he lacked a navy, and he could do little to prevent Pompey's crossing. Still, Pompey didn't have enough ships to move his force all at once, and it took 2 crossings, the ships bringing half of his men over before returning for the second half. Caesar tried some clever engineering to try to blockade the harbor, but Pompey easily swatted aside such efforts. After the first half of his force had departed, Pompey was a bit vulnerable, as Brundisium necessarily had half the troops previously available for its defense against Caesar's siege. Pompey would be extremely vulnerable when the time came to leave the defenses and board the ships. If Caesar chose this moment to attack, then no one would be left to stave off the charge, and the embarking troops could get caught in a port and cut down. When the senatorial fleet arrived back to pick up the remaining half of the troops, Pompey ordered the walls manned per usual. He then ordered all the remaining soldiers and cavalry to quietly embark on the waiting vessels. The size of the operation was so large and there were so many men to board, 25,000 in all, that it took nearly 3 days. All the while, Pompey had the walls manned, guards rotated, fires lit, as much noise made as possible, everything done per usual to give the impression that his full force was at the ready. When all but the last of these few brave defenders were aboard, Pompey gave a signal, and these last men sprinted for the ships, boarded, and sailed off. When Caesar realized that the walls were empty, he charged into the city, only to find it completely devoid of Pompey's forces. Just 2 Pompeian ships had yet to leave port. These were easily caught and prevented from leaving. But Pompey got almost every soldier across without Caesar any wiser for the effort. He was one of the last to board, and when he got to Greece, Pompey would have his army at full strength. Impressed by his cunning and his courage, the doubters in the senatorial court fell silent. From here on out, no one was going to second-guess Pompey, at least openly, at least until they did again. With the Adriatic Sea between Pompey and Caesar ahead of their final showdown, this seems like a good place to pause the story. If you're counting, then we've just finished part 5, and we still have one more to go. I know the story is long, but hopefully it's fun. Besides, to this point in his career, a strong case can be made that Pompey wasn't just a great, he was on his way to being the great, at least where Roman history was concerned. What remains is to tell the rest of the story. So that is exactly what we will do next week. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we conclude the story of Pompey.